Skipster is the guest management platform used by top event teams for everything from guest lists to seating charts and online invitations. If you're looking for next-generation event software that helps deliver perfect guest experiences, head over to Skipster's website. It's Skipster, ZKIPSTER.com to try a free event.
Are you a follower? Okay, so we're gonna be
Welcome to GatherGeeks, a podcast by BizBash, the place where people passionate about meetings and events come together. Here are your hosts, BizBash CEO David Adler and Editor-in-Chief Beth Kormanik.
Hi, David.
Hey, Beth. Here we are, another edition of GatherGeeks as we start out the new year.
And our guest today is Adrian Segar. He is a meeting designer and facilitator and a deep thinker on the hows and whys of people gather. Attendees of BizBash Live DC last year heard him speak, and we're excited to have him on GatherGeeks today. Adrian has a new book, Event Crowdsourcing, Creating Meetings People Actually Want and Need. Adrian may be most noted as the creator/coiner of the term unconference. And David, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, what is an unconference?
An unconference is a way that you can actually understand what people really want in real time by asking them right before the event. And people sort of crowdsource their ideas, and then the facilitators say, okay, we're going to try this idea. And there's no pre-planned speakers, there's no pre-planned agenda. You just do it on real time.
And you've done this before,
And I've done
right?
this before, and
Okay.
it's fascinating to see how it works.
Well, Adrian is going to share techniques of organizing an unconference, essentially like using meetings to engineer social interactions and overall creating highly interactive and engaging events, as well as hit on topics such as the value of another popular format, the hosted buyer event, and his take on that. So if your attendees have asked for a new format, or as a planner, you really want to shake up your meetings, here's an introduction to this new style and techniques to try. Let's listen.
So welcome to GatherGeeks, Adrian.
Hi.
You have been pioneering in the world of connecting people for years. Give us a little bit about the new book and how it has built upon the old book and how you've seen the world change. That's not a big question, is it, at all?
No. I can answer that in 3 words or less. I've done a lot of different things professionally in my life, and I always had, right from the start, a desire to organize meetings about initially about what I was professionally interested in, which includes, research in particle physics, which I have an ancient PhD in. I've always had that desire, which I didn't really understand until probably 20, 30 years after I started doing the work that led to the series of books. This is actually my third that I've written now, and I realized eventually that what I love to do and just get great pleasure from, and I like a lot of people in the meeting industry, is facilitating connection between people around something that those people, a group of people, have in common. Whether it's solar energy or physics or educational software or anything, or any kind of for example, all the different associations and what they think of as community of interest groups that exist, on every single topic that anyone, has some curiosity about in the world today. Well, the problem was I would go to traditional physics conferences, like everyone's gone to traditional conferences, where the focus is on relatively few speakers who speak to people who make presentations. And I felt very frustrated going to those, and I think a lot of people do because, particularly these days, that your peers, the people you're sitting next to while you're listening to these people talking, have a lot of interesting information. They're interesting in themselves, and also they represent resources these days, in terms of connections, work, sales, whatever it is you're doing, opportunities that you have no means of making while those lectures are going on. So I became interested and was sparked essentially by accident in creating conferences that were much more participatory and which people could discover, what people actually wanted to talk about and needed to talk about, at the event, and also in the process, obviously, meet other people who were really great connections for them for their own individual purposes. I created the first conference that used that kind of format pretty much out of need in 1992, so that's 27 years ago, and discovered over time, initially that was for a conference on a topic I was professionally involved in at the time, and then people started asking me, they heard about the format and they started asking me to do it in other areas. And I discovered that people loved it, whatever it was. And the format, the kind of this approach of creating a conference that became what people wanted and needed was very, very popular. People loved it.
Can you describe what that was, so we get a context?
Well, in a nutshell, it's you have a beginning where you learn about the other people at the event in a structured and very targeted, focused way. You learn about the things that attendees actually want to know about other people at a meeting. They want to know, well, who are you? Where did you come from? You want to know, you learn individually and collectively what people are interested in actually talking about. People, anyone who goes to a conference these days has problems, questions, concerns that they want to have addressed, that they're hoping somehow the meeting will address. You again, during this initial process, you also discover the other people in the room who are resources for you or who you are resources for. You take all that information, this is the outline of what happens at these kinds of events, and you take all that information, and there are many ways of doing this, and turn that into an on-the-fly program that actually optimizes the event for everybody there. So it creates an event that actually is responsive to the actual wants and needs of the people who are there. And that's the beginning of, that's the sort of first piece of these kinds of events. And then the middle is kind of, you run that conference program. And of course, it's that central piece, which is, the sort of guts of the conference, is of course very different from a presentation-led, silently listening set of sessions, because most of the people who are presenting or leading those sessions or maybe discussions, didn't know till maybe the day before that they were going to be doing that. So no one is expecting something polished or a lecture. And so these sessions are much more interactive. There's a lot more you learn, you discover the 10 other people who are really fascinated or want to learn more or know a lot about something that you're really interested in, or something that you have in common with them at those sessions. And that's in essence, that's what the program is like. It's full of sessions that people chose. And so the sessions themselves are all popular, and they're about topics that people really care about. The last piece, the end, is a piece that is very important, which most conferences never do, most meetings never use, is how do we take that information and talk about and turn it into, maximize the likelihood that will be turned into change in attendees' lives in the future. If you go to a conference and nothing changes because you went there, one could argue that conference, apart from getting some nice food and entertainment and maybe being in a new place, was pretty much a waste of time, or your boss's, your organization's money in sending you there. So hopefully you go to meetings and this meeting will have changed your life in important ways. And the last part of of these kinds of conferences, these participant-driven and participation-rich meetings, is a set of closing sessions which optimize the likelihood that each person individually will actually do stuff.
Well, how does that work?
Well, again, now we're going into details. I have a session for that called a personal introspective, which is a session where you think about what you want to change. This is right after the conference program, right before the end of the conference. What do I want to change? Because of what I've learned. You go to conferences, you have all these great ideas, and we all know that you get back to work and these ideas kind of sit on pieces of paper on your desk a lot of the time, and you don't ever implement them because you're too busy, dealing with the rest of your, your ongoing professional life. So this is a session that sets aside time, a structured process for people to think about what I want to change, and then allows them to figure out what they're going to do specifically in terms of measurable outcomes that they create for themselves. And there's a piece of that session that also includes small group work, which also increases the likelihood that change will actually happen.
So there's accountability.
So that's the individual.
That's accountability. It's accountability piece.
It's exactly. It's a very informal. It's like no one's going to say, yeah, you have to do this, but we all know that if we make a resolution about something and then we talk to a group of people who are supportive about it and say, hey, I'm going to do this. I have a question about, and you might might ask for support about that. Like, has any of you done this before? What do you think about that? You got any tips for me, and so on? And that group of people give you some support on that, and then that happens for everybody in the small group. That's more likely that change will actually take place. Facilitating change in one's life or other people's lives is very hard, and so this session is about making that as easy as possible. And then there is also a final session where we bring everyone together, and I always start that with a group evaluation of the whole event. So you're building a community consensus, or at least the community experience of what the event was for everybody as a whole, which is a very valuable process because it does help to build event community. People will talk about the great stuff that happened, and people also, and this is crucial, will talk about things that could be done to make the event, if it happens again, even better. We didn't do this, we should do this, and 20 people say, yeah, we should do that then, or the conference organizers say, yeah, that's a great idea, let's put that into next year's conference. So you're building a better event. I call these kinds of sessions future crowdsourcing in my book, and also you're doing something that's very, very powerful for a conference community. You're allowing the attendees, giving the attendees the experience of what they say, and their experiences actually matter much better than filling in a form that an online evaluation. If you fill it in a week later and you never hear what the results of that is, you don't know what anybody else says. You're actually doing this live at the event, and it's a very simple but very powerful process.
So what you wrote wrote 3 books on this.
Yes, I have.
What are the topics of the books to walk people through how these books can help them do this?
Sure. So the first book is called Conferences That Work, and it basically sets out, that book came out exactly 10 years ago, a week or two ago, and it was my first attempt at describing how to run from soup to nuts a small, what at the time was a small event, less than 100 people, of this kind. And it's a very complete, it's actually a perfect book for people who want to run a very small conference that's focused around a very specific topic, and who've never done anything like that before, because that's the position I was in 10 years ago when I was an amateur essentially in the meeting industry. I'd been doing meetings for many, many years, but it wasn't my day job. It was just a sideline that I was doing as largely unpaid because I was motivated, as I described at the beginning of this. So that's the first book, which is called Conferences That Work, Creating Events That People Love. And that when that book came out, and I think, I met you, David, right when that book came out, and you kindly bought a copy, and suddenly I was in the meeting industry, which I knew almost nothing about. So it's been 10 years. The second book is called The Power of Participation, and it concentrates on a different aspect and introduces a lot of new tools for creating these kinds of meetings and also sessions that become what people want and need. So I think of the second book as a sort of tool chest of techniques, of many different techniques that you can use to create these kinds of meetings. And the book, again, has, like the Conferences That Work, which is almost a manifesto. In the first part of Conferences That Work, describes why I came to create this kind of meeting, because I was so dissatisfied, and I think so many people are, dissatisfied with traditional conference formats. So the second book is a sort of tool chest of techniques that you can use, and it includes portions where you can basically say, well, this is what I want to do, and then the book says, well, these are the techniques you should consider. And then there is a chapter for every technique which describes in a lot of detail, why when you should use it, and then how to prepare for it, and then step by step how to do each technique. And so, and that was, I thought that would be my last book. And I thought that was it. And then I realized that I really wanted to write one more book, which is this latest book that's just come out called Event Crowdsourcing, creating meetings people actually want and need. And it's obviously a theme that exists in the first two books. But this book really focuses on the actual creation of the meeting itself, or the session, on how to make meetings have exactly the the optimal program for the group of people who are there, and also how you can do the same thing even for an individual session. So it's a useful book for presenters as well. So many presenters just have a canned approach to their, they don't really interact with their audience, and they have no idea really most of the time whether the audience is at the right level for the talk that they're giving. And so on. And this book includes techniques at the session level so that you can, on the fly, very simple techniques, so on the fly you can discover what people actually want to talk about and build a session on the fly that, again, meets people's needs.
When you said the first book was about meetings 100 or below, what is an optimal size to scale a meeting like this? I mean, how many people does it stop working for, or does it always work?
Well, that's a really good question, and we all know this. I mean, we all know this. You and I having a conversation right now. We have complete freedom to move around and go in different directions. You have a group of 5 or 10 people, things move much more slowly. So the answer to your question is, there's some research on this that. Once you have groups that are together, which have more than about 100, maybe 150, Dunbar's number is the reference if people want to look it up. Those groups start becoming stratified, and there are parts of those groups that don't have much in common and don't interact very much with other members in that group, larger groups. So the trick is, when you're doing large conferences, it doesn't mean that these things don't work, these techniques don't work for larger events. Though I want to mention that most meetings in the United States, certainly these days, actually I think this is globally true, are less than 100 people. We hear all the hoopla and read in the meeting magazines about very large meetings because they are wonderful things, and they have lots of resources, and one can try out all kinds of new wonderful things there and have great speakers and so on. But the reality is that most meetings are, in the United States, this is from hotel data, are under 100 people, where the kinds of techniques I've been writing about are working incredibly well. But anyway, the trick is, if you have a larger meeting, what you need to do to get this kind of participation and interactivity and allow people to discover the other, 10 people at the meeting who it's like, I'm so glad I met you at this meeting, and that I would never have met you at, at a traditional conference unless I was incredibly lucky and sat down next to you, is to split those large meetings into smaller sub-meetings. So if you have, 1,000, I did a conference a few years ago, medical conference with 500 people, and it turned out that they were folks who were running very large medical offices in the United States. And it turned out that there were differences between how, let's say, oncology medical offices worked from, obstetrics, for example. So it made sense to divide those 500 people into 10 groups of 50 by their medical specialty of the organization that they were working in administratively, and run essentially sort of parallel meetings where those 50 people in each group could actually get to know each other well and discover resources and learn from each other, from people who were who did what they did, who understood what they did. Is that if you create a conference that the participants love, everything else falls into place. Other stakeholders are going to be happy.
Totally agree. Building a memorable experience for your guest means planning every detail right. Skipster is the guest management platform designed to help you create the perfect experience, from impressive online invitations to seamless check-in at the door. Get started at Skipster, spelled ZKIPSTER.com, for a free test event.
Let's go to, you had in the second book, you talked about sort of participation, and in the third book you talked about also how people that are doing sessions can really make their sessions great. More people are doing sessions than hosting large events, or in many cases. So when you're asked to lead a session, is there a way to do this? And a lot of times it's an hour. Can you do this in an hour and change the way you lead a session so that everybody that's leading a session will be more relevant to the people in the room?
Well, the beautiful thing about this whole format is that when someone is asked to do this, the whole you've basically modeled this whole approach throughout the conference. The culture of the conference is very different. The culture is not like there are a few people who know everything and everyone else listens to them. The culture is much more like everybody has unique expertise and experience. Obviously, some people have more than others. We're going to use this process that discovers who the folks who can lead those sessions productively are, because they've done stuff or they are great discussion leaders or whatever it is, and we will create those sessions.
I understand that. Let me push back a little bit. I'm actually asking a different question, I think, and I may be wrong. Yeah. But let's say you're asked to do a conference at Dreamforce, 200,000 people in the room, and you are asked, I want to do a session, and I'm going to come back to the organizer and say, I am planning on doing this unconference for my session. And so that you micro this whole thing just for your hour or hour and a half. Is it as effective doing that? Can you modify this so that it would work in an individual session, not necessarily for the entire conference? So you're the star and you end up with the best session in the whole place because you're using this technique.
Yes, absolutely. You can. I mean, I'm running a town meeting tomorrow with there'll probably be 100 people there. We have a couple of hours to discuss some very knotty issues, and I'm using a technique I've used for years, a discussion technique, which will allow those 100 plus people, many of them, an opportunity to talk about the issues that are there. Now, I know how to do that. My books describe. On the other hand, I'm actually doing that for 1 hour of the 2 hours. There's a woman in town who I sent the chapter of my book for the technique we're going to use, which is like a 4-page chapter, and she said, "Oh, that's easy. I can do that." So these are not hard techniques to use. What happens actually at events is what I provide. I've discovered, and I've done this for I don't know how many. Maybe 2 decades now, I provide folks who are going to lead a session, once they've been chosen or asked to run the session, they say yes, with literally an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with that contains a few hundred words describing how to do this, and the results are excellent. There are kind of standard pitfalls that people, if they were just asked to do this cold, fall into all the time. And
you need to tell us some of those things. What's the technique called that you were doing in your session?
Tomorrow I'm using a fishbowl, or actually it's actually going to be what's called a fishbowl sandwich, which is something called a fishbowl, which is a standard discussion technique where very briefly all the conversation, if you anyone in the room can speak, but to speak you have to be sitting in one of 4 chairs that are in front of the room, and anyone at any time can go up to one of those chairs, and if there's a chair empty, and take it, and there's a moderator in one of those chairs who basically moderates what happens in the other 3 chairs, and if all the chairs are full and someone walks up, then the person who's been speaking the longest has to someone has to step down and so on, and it's moderated. But it's so that's, and the sandwich part is there's a little pair share piece at the start, which is a few minutes where you get everybody in the room to answer a question to the person sitting next to them. which gets people into the mode of like, wow, I have an opinion about this particular thing.
What kind of question?
Well, for example, tomorrow the question will be: we are actually working on a plan that has just been suggested for a major institution in my little rural town, and the question is going to be: what do you think? What do you to tell your neighbor in a minute or so? What do you think about this plan? What are your feelings about this plan? And everyone's in pairs, and A spends a minute telling B in the pair, what they think, and then B tells A. And it's a very simple technique, but what that does is it gets people out of I'm just going to sit here and listen to things. I don't have anything to contribute. It gets people's brains working. So we'll do that, and then we'll do the fishbowl. So that's.
What are some of the other names? I love. What are some of the other? You've actually branded these topics. So what are some of the ones?
So and I wouldn't say I've invented most. I steal a lot, and I do invent stuff too.
What's another one that's that you've found effective?
How do you take a group of say 150 people over lunch and decide? Like earlier this year, I worked for did some work for a large corporation that had a one-day client conference, and they hired me. They said, we want to have some sessions at the end of the day that the clients choose themselves. And there are, I think, 150 people here. And they said, can you do something really quickly so we can figure out what those 12 sessions will be? And I said, sure, we'll do this at lunch. We can do this at lunchtime. It'll take, 10 minutes. I can do it during lunch. And we did a technique called Post-it, where we just use large Post-it notes, and basically everyone has the opportunity to suggest a topic that they would either like to attend, or in a different colored Post-it note they use for a topic that they would like to offer. Because some of those clients had done some really neat things with this company's products that they said, we'd like to know if anyone's interested in this neat thing we did with this company's products, and we'd like to offer a session on that. And that information is taken. They go ahead. Those people went on with their lunch, and then a small group took those Post-it notes and clustered them and said, oh, it's pretty obvious. There's a lot of people interested in this, and there's a lot of people interested in this. There are 6 authors here, which look great to us. We know who these people are. They can obviously talk about this. And then there are 6 topics that company people should address. And we know who should address those.
So what's another one?
Oh, you want another one?
Yeah, these are fun. More? Yes.
These are fun. Again, the other thing is finding out about the group. So, for example, there's a whole set of techniques, which I call, and probably other people would call this, human spectrograms. So one of the things I'm going to do tomorrow, there's going to be a lot of different people in this room, and they will represent various constituencies. Some people work for the organization in town. Some people, and they have different roles in that organization. This is that this plan is about. Some people are townspeople. Some people are, for example, there may be media in the room. There's very simple techniques one can use, and are very valuable when you have got a room of people who know nothing about each other. In a few minutes, you can show people. People can discover who else is there who is like them.
So how do you do that?
Well, the simplest way I'm going to use tomorrow, because the room's going to be pretty crowded, is everyone's going to be sitting in chairs. I'm going to have people stand up. I'm going to say, how many people live in this town? Everyone stand up and so on. And I will say, well, it looks like about, 90 people here, who are at this meeting live in this town. Sit down, and then we'll ask how many people do this at this organization, how many people do that. And so we'll see the different representative groups, because this is a very complex problem that involves a lot of different stakeholders in the town.
But the standing up is very participatory.
Well, there's a lot to be said for standing up, for people standing up. That's an informational thing where the group learns about itself, who's there, which is valuable. But then there are things this isn't really spectrograms, but for example, a typical thing for a human spectrogram, the one I often use, for example, when you've got a group in the room, is I have people figure out how many years they've been in the business or the industry or the association or whatever it is that they work with. And I tell people, just come up with a number. No one's going to check. And then I have them arrange themselves in the room by that number. So they talk to each other. They form a line. So people who have just entered the industry at one end of the line, and people who are veterans are at the other end. And I usually go and interview the people who are the veterans, like, someone here's been doing this for 45 years, and so on. And that's interesting information. The people get to learn about each other from the industry experience, but also it's a group thing because I usually find the middle of the line, ask what the middle is, which is often around 10 years in many businesses. And then you multiply that by the number of people in the line. So let's say there's 100 people in that line. That means you tell people, look, there's 1,000 years of experience in this industry in this room, and we're going to tap that.
Okay, so far we've had three in the spectrogram. You've divided into two different types. What do you call the spectrogram where you do the years? Is that different than the ones where people stand up? Or
I call that an experience. I call that an experience spectrogram. I mean, it's what's called a one-dimensional. I call a one-dimensional human spectrogram because it's a line.
Right.
But I wanted to mention the other, probably the most popular one that I try and do whenever possible, which is a two-dimensional human spectrogram. And what you do with that is you have a conference with people from, say, all over North America or the world. It doesn't, whatever it is, who you throw up on the screen, you throw up a map of the region where people come from, and then you turn the room into a representation. You say, I'm standing here, in Boston. We're in Boston. I'm standing here. If you were in this place in the room, and if you live in Boston or work in Boston, you're going to be standing near me, and that direction is north, and California is that way, and so on. And then you ask people to move to where they live or work, whatever it is you want to do. Into the correct place that represents that place in the room. And you can do this with hundreds of people. I've done this with hundreds of people, and it's wonderful. So you can take 500 people in the room, and in a few minutes, the people who live in Southern California or up in Toronto or wherever it is, or down in Mexico, have all found each other, and you ask people to move around. They talk to each other. Oh, I live down the street, and then you give them a little bit of time to swap business cards, and bingo, you've just introduced everybody who lives regionally near each other to each other in a few minutes at the start of the event, which is incredibly valuable.
Right.
Think of the kind of context you can build there, and the relationships you can build because you discover that there's someone who does just what you do who lives, a mile away from you at a national conference. That's valuable.
Let's go into is there another one that sort of goes even more analytical on, or pushes people a little harder? Is there sort of different levels of these participants?
Well, yes. Well, so for example, you can use spectrograms. I love spectrograms because they're very, very flexible, and you can build them on the fly. So, for example, let's say you have a contentious topic. A topic that there's some disagreement about, or some different viewpoints about in an industry. I mean, in the meeting industry, the one I use when I do this in the meeting industry is the value of hosted buyer events. And there are a lot of people that think people who will think those are great, and there are people like, and of course it does depend on what your role is in the meeting industry. So you can create a human spectrogram, a one-dimensional human spectrogram, where you basically say, okay, if you absolutely adore X and you think it's the best thing since sliced bread, go and stand by that wall over there. If you absolutely think it's the worst idea, go and stand by the wall on the other side of the room. And obviously most people will be somewhere in between, and place yourself how you feel about a particular topic along that line. And that's a very interesting, a very useful technique for people because you can discover, first of all, the whole group can see what the sort of group consensus is about that, and the distribution is often very interesting. And then you can actually use that. Let's say you're discussing a topic, you can a moderator can take a microphone and walk up to the folks who are, let's say, really pro this thing and say, give us a few reasons why you feel this way. And then walk to the middle of the line or the opposite end of the line, and there's a variant of the fishbowl where you can actually use this technique to actually deal with tensions in an industry. Let's say you have two sides on an issue. You can use a fishbowl, a circular fishbowl, approach, I call a two-sided fishbowl, to allow people to understand the opposite point of view better. So that's another.
So how does that work in the fishbowl? You bring people from the opposing perspective to talk?
So what you do is you do a human spectrogram first, and then you say, okay, everybody who's like pro is one side. Everybody we're talking about polarizing things. I use this for sort of, helping to bring communities together about a divisive issue, for example. So you start off with a spectrogram, and you use that to discover the people who think X is good, and the people who think X is not so great, they don't think we should do that, let's say. And then what you do is you set up two circles of chairs, and you have one group, let's say the pro group, sits in the middle in a circle first, and the sort of anti-group, or the group that's skeptical, let's say, sits outside. And the pro group then has a discussion amongst themselves, or basically talk about why they think the pro issue is a good, why they are in favor of, why they are pro. And the folks outside can ask questions of that group, but they can't actually respond to them. So the concept is, in this first round, the anti-folk are learning about why the pro folks think why they're pro. And then you flip, obviously, and the anti-folks have their turn in the center, and they talk about why they are anti, and the pro folks can ask them questions. So this is a very simple technique that you can use to, work on, institutional issues or regional issues, or whatever it is you're working on.
So what happens though? What is the natural outcome of this kind? Do people change their perspective, or are they stuck?
Yes,
stuck
sometimes
to their guns?
they do. Well, it's fascinating. It's very, very interesting. I guess a lot of my work is related to the belief that that pretty much all people want connection of some kind. And one of the ways to reduce or to increase understanding of people you disagree with or you have different viewpoints about is to meet them as people rather than meeting them, as position papers or rants on the internet and so on. I've used these kinds of techniques, for example, for the state of Vermont, a group in the state of Vermont has been using these techniques in an annual conference for years now, which bring together on issues of equity and inclusion. And it brings together folks who have tremendous power in the state, the chief of police and so on, with minority youth and activists and religious community, people, all the different stakeholders. And these people have been learning at these annual conferences to, even though they disagree with each other, to actually be able to hear and understand better the perspectives of the people, and also realize that the people who have these different perspectives have their reasons, and they're human beings, and can learn to will often can appreciate each other better, and the experience has been that practically it has meant that some of the issues that routinely turn up around, in this case, diversity and the equity and inclusion in the state of Vermont, are now being dealt with by these people directly rather than through the media or social media and so on. A lot of my work is related to the fact that it is possible to the human connection at meetings is something that these days has become, I think, in some way around pertinent information has become more important than just the broadcast of information, which is what meetings traditionally have been.
Are there any other techniques that you are pioneering that you think should have a good future, but they're just not ready for prime time yet?
There are many other. There's one other. Here's one thing that I do, for example, which again is not, which is probably the most popular I run this as a plenary for people. I've done it all over the United States, North America. And it's also been run in Europe as well. Started invented in Europe. I didn't invent this. It's something called the Solution Room, and it's an opportunity. It's basically an opportunity for a group of people, and this will scale. You can do it with 1,000 people. You basically divide people into small groups that have at round tables. They sit at round tables, and they have a range of experiences. We were talking earlier with the experience spectrogram. At each table, so you've got people relatively new and veterans at every table. And what you do is it's an opportunity for each person to get consulting help, confidential consulting help on a top of mind issue that's obviously related to the things that these people have in common from their peers. And it's a very simple format. You can run it in, an hour and a quarter and so on for 1,000 people. It does two things. First of all, people get amazing answers from the other people at their table. And secondly, you discover, often people discover that, wow, I actually know something about this. I was actually useful to people. And it's a wonderful way to build relationships. I've done this with a room full of people. Most recently, I did it with a large room full of attorneys, none of whom knew each other. They were all single practice attorneys. And at the end of the meeting, the session was over and no one left for like half an hour. It's like, business cards flying and can I meet you for lunch next week? And this has been so great. And thank you so much for helping me with this issue that I've been struggling with. So that works. And I've run that for all kinds of different. It works beautifully for any kind of group of people with a common interest, and because everyone has an issue, a professional issue that they could use some help with, and everyone gets to choose what that issue is, and then get consulting help on it. That's called the Solution Room.
That's great. I mean, some of these, we've experienced the Jeffersonian dinner party together. I mean, I find those really interesting, but these techniques are really something that if people knew, I mean, we talk about how event organizers have to be collaboration artists, and I think you are probably the lead collaboration artist, because I was wondering if there is any research on the friendships that are formed at these kind of events have such a lasting, they're more lasting than other relationships that you make at other types of events. I don't know if you have any research.
Well, I think about in our industry, you remember and went to many of the, event camps that we ran.
Yes.
And some of those were, fairly structured events, but they were relationships were built. I mean, that's where I met you at the first ever event camp in New York City 10 years ago. There are relationships that were built, that have been built at these events that continue. I'm still friends with a lot of those people I met 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of, and what I want to emphasize, I mean, you've had that experience. That is the norm at these kinds of events that I've been describing. That is the norm. And that's why I got into all this, and eventually, it took me 4 years to write conferences that work, and it was very hard for me to write because I'd never written a book before. And I spent those first 2 years thinking, I can't do this. But I was really motivated to do it simply because there were so many people who, in their paper evaluations in those days, said, I don't want to go to another conference that isn't like this. This was so much better than the regular conferences that I went to. And so, that's what I really want to emphasize. And I'd love it if, people on this podcast bought my books and learned about these things, that some of the things, many more things than what we've been talking about today. But the only way you will really learn the power of these techniques is to experience them. You can read a book about it. It's not the same as actually going and building these kinds of relationships that, so you and I have known each other for 10 years as a result of a small event like that.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. A lot of people say, they say they met at the first Comic-Con or the first CES, because at the time they were more like your conference techniques when you first get started. They're small and It's interesting.
I say this in conferences that work, that every single association or conference that got started, that started in this way. You had what I would call a community of interest. Well, I didn't invent that term, but you had a group of people who said, we're doing something new. We've never done this before, so Comic-Con, whatever. And this is great. We're all fans of this. We're all professionally involved in this, and we want to learn more. And there's no existing structure, to do that. There's no conference or any way we've never met before. And when you come together for the first time under those circumstances, you don't know who the experts are. You don't have the material necessary for that standard conference model that we've all been sort of indoctrinated into, where it's like, well, who are the experts? So we'll invite them to speak. They don't exist at that moment. And so the birth of, and this is true for every association that exists, that first annual conference was much more of this form. The problem is that, we have been, and I've written a lot about this, particularly in Conferences That Work in my first book, that we are indoctrinated, and in the second book as well, Power of Participation, that we are indoctrinated in all kinds of ways, often through our educational system, to believe that the only way we can learn anything is to have someone who knows a great deal more about that thing tell it to us. And that structure, which still exists in the world of education today, and that that our teachers were involved in, and certainly that's how I was told I should learn stuff. Makes it very, very hard for us to consider alternatives that are actually much more effective, and once you experience them, you realize it, than the traditional, hierarchical conference.
Well, let's wrap this up. I want people to know where to get your book and how to get in touch with you.
Absolutely. So pretty much everything I write about and have spoken about today can be learned more about at my website, which is conferencesthatwork.com. All one word, conferencesthatwork.com. My books are all available there. You can buy them directly from me. And if you do, first-time buyers I love to talk to people who buy my books, and so first-time buyers get a free 30 minutes of my time, mutually convenient time to talk about whatever we want to talk about together. And the paperbacks are available on Amazon everywhere, bookstores everywhere, and so on. But if you want to buy the ebooks, which are very popular, people buy those all over the world, you can only get those at my website. But they're just $11, so it's not that much money.
Definitely.
And I love to talk to people about this work and about my work. I'm obviously passionate about it, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. You David, have done it. I love how you are such a big picture thinker, and that you are, and I also love your curiosity, and really appreciate your support over the years.
I think you're connecting the world in ways that people are not necessarily appreciating as much as they should.
Well, I would agree with you, and I know it's a long process, and we have seen changes.
Yes.
One of the things I would say is that in the last 10 years, we've really, people are much more aware of the importance of creating connection, true connection and participation in events, but they still, a lot of the time, don't know how to do it, and that is what I am doing my best to share with people, that this is, you can do this, you can do it much better than you've probably experienced it in the past, and it's not hard. And I'd love, to tell you, to share with you how that can be done.
Great.
And that's my work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you so much, David, for having me on.
Okay, we're back. Thanks, David. Unconferences, so they can feel like a risk if you've never tried them before. How does an adventurous planner convince the C-suite to go this route?
I think they have to demonstrate. Once you've been to one of these, it's a lot easier to actually do it. But I think that it's not as much of a risk as they think once they experience it.
So the answer is getting that C-suite person to try it themselves.
They have to try it themselves, and they have to like trust the planner that's recommending it. In most cases, if they trust the person, I believe that we're all sort of collaboration artists, and that these are techniques that actually do work engage people in a higher level.
Okay, one other question. In an unconference, the presentations are not polished, and that's by design because these speakers may not know they're presenting till they get to the conference. So how does that square with our previous GatherGeeks episode on creating better presentations?
That is a very interesting question, Beth. I think that there is a place for both of these types of approaches. I think with the unconference, you're getting into the empty white space that nobody would even think of talking about until you get there. And so I think that there's room for both of them. I don't think that there's absolutely one without the other. So Beth, what is going on at BizBash?
So January is a month of major events. We're all getting back from the holidays and getting deep into it. And so I want to just highlight, check out our coverage of CES online, the Golden Globes, and our look at the best style and event design ideas from recent fundraising benefits and galas from across North America. Find it all at bizbash.com.
Fantastic. Well, before we go, we want to thank our producers, Dave Nelson and Rebecca Pappas, who gets it out there to distribute it to all of our outlets like Stitcher and Apple Music and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and the whole alphabet soup of all of these. And also Claire Hoffman, who does a wonderful job of keeping us on task and writing the descriptions and getting out there as well so that you understand what we're talking about. So until next time, what do we say, Beth?
Gather on.
Gather on.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. We can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Player FM, Google Play, and Pocket Cast. Be sure to leave us a rating and review. It helps others discover the GatherGeeks podcast. We'd also love to hear from you. You can leave feedback on Twitter at GatherGeeks or leave us an email, gathergeeks@bizbash.com. We hope you'll join us again for the next episode of GatherGeeks. Until then, gather on.